Welcome to Verbal Weekly. Today's episode has an interesting name. We're calling it Passages Are Made of Flesh and Bones. Why are we calling it that? Not because we're going to look at passages on anatomy, thankfully. It's for a different reason. But before I get to that reason, let's set some ground rules for today's episode. These will help you learn a little bit more from this episode than if you simply just watched it. So in the description, there is a passage that you can access. It would be a good idea to have the passage handy so that you can do some work on your side while watching the video. This will also keep things a little less boring for you, particularly since we are dealing with passages in this episode. So now, let me get to the name. In the previous episode, we had talked about differentiating between main points and supporting information. But we had taken short paragraphs. This time, we're going to apply the same concept to reading a passage. So when we say passages are made of flesh and bones, the bones obviously are the main points, and the flesh is the stuff that is not as important because it's only supporting the main points. I know that in biological terms, it's kind of the other way around, but give me some creative freedom for this episode and let's move forward. Now, sometimes when we look at art, we want to look at all the details because it's the details that make the art interesting. But a lot of times, we would prefer to simplify it. For example, maybe something like this. Sometimes we may want to look at an even simpler interpretation of the same thing. Maybe something like this. What if we decided to look at passages in a somewhat similar fashion? So passages, like people, are made of flesh and bones. What does that mean? It means that we can look at the passage in its entirety. So far, we've taken a very short passage for you. So if I started reading it, I would have to read and remember quite a bit of information. But what if we only focused on the bones of this passage? Maybe then we would just focus on this line here. So how do I know that this point is important? Well, because the first line introduces a general perspective. But right after that, there is a word, but. Now, this seems to suggest that the author is contradicting this general perspective. And that is how I know that this line is probably important because the author wants to draw attention to it. In different passages, you may not have explicit clues. But if you remember any of the content from the previous episode, we had talked about how if you are constantly looking for main points in whatever you're reading, then the task of reading and comprehension becomes a lot simpler. So we're going to try a similar approach for the passage that we have today. It's not this one. This is too easy. Let's look at something a little more complicated. So every passage is written with a purpose in mind. I'm not going to randomly decide to start scribbling something. Now we have to figure out what the author's purpose is. Sometimes it might be to inform, sometimes it might be to present an opinion, sometimes it might be to analyze or understand something and reach a conclusion. We don't really know that. So how do we get to know it? Obviously, by looking at each paragraph one at a time. So every paragraph has a specific function, otherwise why create that paragraph? But not all the sentences in the paragraph are important. We learned this in the previous episode as well. So every paragraph usually will have a main point that is being conveyed and the rest of it is supporting information or background information. We're going to take a look at what each paragraph contains and how to distinguish between main and supporting points because that is how you can reduce a passage to its bones. Now let's take a look at how do you distinguish between main ideas and supporting information, or rather, what is supporting information? So some of it is a recap of what we did in a previous episode, but in case you've missed it, no problem, we have it for you right here. So a paragraph can contain background information. Background information could be something like an anecdote. It could be a joke. It could be a rhetorical question. Why do we have this content in a passage? Because we don't want to start off with a boring point. We want to get the reader's attention. So a lot of times we will start off with something that helps to catch the reader's attention and then slowly build up to the main point. So there may be background information in the first paragraph. It could also be there in the remaining paragraphs. Other than that, we have supporting points, which could be examples, some sort of statistics, data, reasons, and sometimes even explanations. But what you have to be on the lookout for is the author's main point or the key idea in that particular paragraph. And the only way that it will work is if you read each paragraph, pause, and then try to identify the main point in that paragraph. Don't be in a hurry to read the whole passage, because if you do that, then you will lose sight of the main ideas. So again, we're trying to reduce a passage to its bones by differentiating between the important information and the not so important information. It doesn't mean that you skim through the passage, you still read, but you read with a focus on the main points. Now, let's get started with the exercise. Now, if you look at the directions, it says read each paragraph and identify the sentences that convey the important points. But which paragraphs are you supposed to read? Well, for this episode, we have made the passage available in the description. So, this would be a good place to pause the video, maybe get a hold of that passage and read only the first paragraph. That's it. What we are going to do is present one paragraph on the screen, and then we will try to identify the main point in each paragraph. Maybe by the end of it, you'll start feeling a lot more comfortable with this exercise. This is your first paragraph. It starts off with a whole bunch of questions. They're conversational. Again, you should realize that the intention here is to get your attention, to get you to read further. But what is the main point? It's just one specific sentence. And here it is the last one. How do we know it is the main point? Because this is where the author raises the most important question. Are dreams just dreams, or are they trying to convey something important to us? Before that, it's general conversation. It's trying to build a rapport with the reader. But here is where the author introduces the topic. Now let's look at the next paragraph and see if you can identify one or two sentences that contain the main point of this paragraph. So in this paragraph, we seem to have a lot of data. There are some historical references as well. Throughout history and across cultures, dreams have been associated with prophecy. You know what prophecies are. They're predictions about the future. People thought dreams were messages from the gods sent to give us knowledge or insight. And even today, many people can recall a time they dreamed about an event, person or place, and then later the dream came true in real life. So what are we trying to say here? It seems to suggest that a lot of people historically and even now believe that dreams are trying to give us information about the future, that they can be used to predict what's going to happen next. And this is pretty much conveyed to me by the first three sentences. After that, there is a lot of data that does make it interesting and it supports whatever has been said earlier, but I don't have to read it as carefully. I've already understood what the author wants to convey. So, what are the sentence or sentences that convey the main point? Well, I would probably pick these two. Why these two? Why not all the three sentences at the beginning? Simply because I'm trying to establish that this has been the case historically and it is true today also. So even today is obviously an extension of a thought that I have already presented. So always look at the transition words. Look at these phrases that connect one thought to another. That's going to give you a really good idea of whether the author is extending the same idea or whether the author is contradicting something that has been said earlier. Now we're going to keep performing this exercise. So you know what to do now. Read the next paragraph and see if you can identify the main point. And here it is a single sentence. It's fairly easy in this paragraph, right? Because there are examples and the examples are not really the main point. So let's look at the first sentence. It's not too difficult to believe that by coincidence, a dream event is followed by a real life event that's similar to it. So what we're trying to convey here is that a lot of times, the fact that our dreams come true could be coincidental. Then there is the example of dreams of a phone call from an old friend or the death of someone close, for example, are likely to be the result of coincidence. And of course, we probably choose to forget all the times we dream about events that did not come true. So this is trying to say that, dreams are not necessarily prophetic. It could just be a coincidence because we do dream about things that can happen every day. Unlike the paragraphs that we have looked at so far, this one is a little more dense, which means that there is a lot of content that we need to pay attention to. So we are trying to say that in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were two main ideas about dreams. And after that, it explains what these two main ideas are. There is really no way that we can simplify this paragraph any further. We do need to notice what these two ideas are and understand them. So one is Freud's theory, and then there is a theory that opposed Freud's theory. And once we have understood these two ideas, we know that we can move on to the next paragraph. So please go ahead, read it, and pick two sentences that can convey the main point here. So we shall move on. Again, it's right at the beginning. We're starting off this paragraph with but. Usually, if there's a sentence that starts with a but or a however, that is a sentence that you should pay attention to because, again, the whole point of using that word is to contradict something which is a popular view. So, probably the author wants you to notice that, hey, what I have said earlier is not the right perspective. This is the right perspective. So, we pay attention to the first sentence. But perhaps the truth about dreams lies somewhere in the middle of these two ideas. So the author is saying that, dreams are not always prophecies, but nor are they entirely insignificant. There is a middle path. So what is this middle path? Maybe dreams are the result of our mind organizing the thoughts we have during the day, but they appear in dreams with symbolic meaning. So what the author is trying to convey is that yes, we do dream about everyday things, and that on the face of it may not be very important, but if we can interpret those dreams because they can be symbolic, then maybe we will learn something about what is going to happen. So the author's main point here again is conveyed right at the beginning. After that, it's mostly an elaboration of what has been established right at the beginning of this paragraph. So we're almost at the end of this passage. Please identify the main points in this last paragraph. Now here again, the important bits are at the beginning and the end. What this means is this. When the author says what this means is, then the author is interpreting something for you. It's kind of like a conclusion. So we should definitely pay attention to the first line. And the last one again starts off with a but, which means that the author is trying to say that this sentence is important. But the key to understanding exactly what they mean to you is to connect them to events and feelings in your daily life. At the end of it, what was the purpose of this exercise? The purpose of this was to say that when we read passages, one of the reasons that we have trouble retaining what we've read or even understanding what we're reading is that our minds are grappling with every little detail. But that's not really the right way to read. You need to read with single-minded focus on figuring out the main points. In other words, reduce the passage to its bones. Focus on the skeleton. And if you're able to do that, then you will find that the task of reading is all of a sudden a lot faster and easier. Now we're going to end with a slide where we may not be able to see all the text, but the idea is to tell you how much of a difference this exercise can make. So if we look at the passage in entirety, then it's about 570 words, which is quite a bit to read. What we have done is to reduce the passage to its bare bones, which is about half the size of the entire passage. So this is the stuff that we need to focus on and pay attention to. So now onwards, when you read a passage, try the same exercise. Read it one paragraph at a time and see if you can figure out the main points. At the end of it, have you been able to reduce the passage to its bones? What that means is that in a lot of cases, you might be able to reduce the passage to almost half or 1/3 its size. Some of you may recall that your teachers in school asked you to perform a similar exercise, which is writing the précis of a passage or a text. It's similar to that, except that I'm not asking you to write everything down. It can be a mental paraphrasing as well. Nevertheless, the approach remains the same. Read one paragraph at a time, identify the main points, move on to the next one. I wish you all the best with your reading. We're going to do one more episode on how to read, but in that episode, we're going to talk about text which is slightly more complex. So I hope you're prepared. See you next time.